Hi everyone, welcome to this extremely well organised session. My name is Holly Joseph and this session is perception and attention. So we've got four speakers, or four sets of speakers today, and they'll all have 10 minutes and the questions will wait until after the four speakers have finished. So please use the app to ask the questions. Hopefully everyone knows how to do that now. You just click on the session and then ask a question. If you can't access the app, we do have a microphone, but we'd prefer you to ask them in the app if possible. So our first speaker is virtual. Hopefully somebody is going to play the video. Oh, wonderful. So our first speaker is Beck Poulsen, and she is going to be talking about how auditory processing contributes to the autistic profile.
Hi, my name is Beck Poulsen. I'm a postdoc at Macquarie University, recording from Australia today. Sorry I couldn't be there. I hope you're enjoying it in person though. Today I'm going to be talking about how auditory processing contributes to the autistic profile. It's basically a paper that we're about to submit, and it's a summary of experiential, observational, clinical and neurological literature. It's really not a new idea that the information from the sensory world around us and the way we perceive, digest and respond to the sensory world can have a massive impact on our experiences. Sensory-focused approaches to supporting an autistic person have started to be more grounded in evidence over recent years. Personally, I believe sensory-based supports are integral. And just a heads up in my presentation, I like to use cats. I love cats. So there's Misha. She's my kitten. Yeah, so let's go. I'm going to be talking about auditory experience and how it goes well beyond the hyper and hypo responsivity and sensory interests described by diagnostic manuals. Then I'll be talking about how auditory experiences is related to autistic attributes. I'll be breaking it down into social and non-social attributes, which relates back to the dyad in the DSM-5. Finally, I'll be looking at how auditory environments influence and impact desired participation for autistic people in daily life and throughout the lifespan. But first, what is auditory processing for autistic people? Because the literature does go beyond what we know as hypersensitivity. But first, let's talk about it. This hypersensitivity usually appears early in life and continues throughout the lifespan. Neurologically, it's been described as a decreased sound tolerance, largely due to an enhanced central gain in the brain. So the autistic brain responds more strongly to sound in general. There can be an increased capacity to detect subtle nuances in the auditory landscape. There's a greater perceptual capacity as well, which means not only can we detect the nuances in the environment, but we can have a greater perception of the entire auditory environment. Indeed, some people appear to have difficulty filtering out background noise or being able to focus on an attention-capturing sound, like speech in a noisy environment. Adapting or getting used to an auditory environment can take longer. There is a reduced cortical adaptation to repetitive noises, measured using fMRI. Frequency discrimination and musical memory have been shown to be enhanced in at least a subset of autistic people in some studies. Differences have been identified in the homeostatic plasticity in the central nervous system, which is responsible for auditory adaptation and filtering out noise. Neural connectivity has been shown to be altered, but studies are conflicted in their results. Early studies report brain-wide underconnectivity and others heightened connectivity in localized regions. More recent research has painted a more complex picture with inconsistent findings. This inconsistency may be due to imaging technologies available or might in large reflect heterogeneity. So connectivity might indeed be atypical in autistic people, but in diverse ways. Additionally, a recent autistic-led review suggested that autistic auditory profiles most likely but not exclusively include a variety of diagnosable auditory conditions. I'll quickly highlight these, noting it is an interesting emerging theory about auditory processing. Misophonia is a disorder of sound tolerance characterized by intensely negative emotional reactions to sound, typically irritation, anger, or disgust, in response to trigger sounds like chewing, tapping, sniffing, resulting in significant distress, pathological avoidance behavior, and affecting daily life. Hyperacusis is where a moderate intensity sound is perceived as excessively loud, which can be experienced as overwhelming and sometimes physically painful. This has been linked to a latency in the brainstem responses in autistic people. There is evidence that some subcortical regions contribute to this. Phonophobia is another example, and it's basically just a phobia in the auditory domain. But the fear and the anxiety is not from the sound being loud or abrasive. Let's think about auditory processing now in the context of autistic attributes. First up, language, social, and communication dyad. We know that an autistic person is taking in and holding a greater number of stimuli in the auditory processing pathway of the brain. This can affect awareness of interpersonal cues during dynamic social interactions, such as conversations, and sensing nonverbal cues. Autistic accounts describe that stress, distraction, sensory demands, and difficulties with things like speech and noise can make verbal communication more challenging in the moment, especially when attempting to adhere to neurotypical social norms. Auditory processing influences language development, especially in areas like receptive language skills and communication skills. Some studies suggest that differences in brain responses can predict future language development. To an extent, but more research is needed. Social communication usually requires being constantly aware of one's own behavior, another person's reactions, combined with the unpredictability of what's coming next in an interaction. These fast-paced, cognitively taxing mental operations must be performed rapidly in the moment. On top of this, there is the physiological responses to sound. These are autonomic stress reactions, and they could further exacerbate overload in social settings, which presents a constant stream of that auditory and multisensory information. So with all this in mind, it can lead to cognitive fatigue and overload. This auditory distress and overload can greatly limit autistic people's opportunities to participate in the community environments they want to, such as schools, workplaces, universities, social gatherings, just to name a few. And all of this leads to sensory overload, shutdown, or meltdown. It seems reasonable to suppose that the impacts of auditory sensory distress can both reduce autistic people's opportunities to participate as desired and exacerbate their social marginalisation. Non-social autistic attributes are clinically described as restrictive and repetitive behaviours and rigidity. This is where sensory responsivity is contained in that dyad. Now, I've already spoken about the autistic auditory profile, so I'm going to focus on the rest of the dyad. It's reported that sensory processing does appear to predict repetitive motor behaviours and vocal stimming in autistic people. These behaviours have clinically been defined as being apparently meaningless and not developmentally appropriate and functionally impairing. However, autistic people frequently describe these stereotypies as having a self-regulatory function. It seems possible then that repetitive behaviours can be a self-soothing mechanism for people facing sensory overload. The autistic developed monotropism account of autism suggests that autistic people often intensely focus on a narrow range of sensory stimuli with an idiosyncratic interest. Experiential research shows attributes such as increased intentional focus, challenges with shifting focus, and the joy and sometimes pain of autistic inertia also often includes a sensory component. Although there is limited research in this area, we can hypothesize from what we know that these autistic attributes are intertwined with auditory processing and sensory processing more broadly. So I've been talking about how auditory processing is intertwined, and here is a summary visual of that. You can see that it is, through the literature, very, very much intertwined within the broader autistic profile. We still need to know more about how it does this though. How does auditory processing impact our daily lives? Differences in auditory responsivity have the potential to impact a person's daily life and longitudinal development, and without providing accommodations, the intolerance of environmental sounds may not only limit a person's opportunities for social and community participation, but also affect health and well-being. Auditory experience is a crucial contributor to the formation of neuronal circuitry throughout the lifespan. And if sensory encoding is altered in a unique combination of ways, it is possible that it can influence neurodevelopment over time and present phenotypically as a neurodivergent group, such as autism. By gaining an understanding of the impact of autistic experiences in daily life, we hope this leads to learning how we can better support autistic people with more accessible community settings and to facilitate desired opportunities with regards to auditory environments. Supporting these needs through environmental adjustments, education, therapies, and supports, and even with technologies, in the end, this can lead to one happy kitty. So thank you for listening today. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow collaborators on this project and my Autistic Advisory Committee and also my funding bodies. So thank you. And of course, Misha the cat. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Beck. So our next speaker is, where's the next slide, is Alexandra Sturrock, who is going to be talking about chasing the conversation, autistic experiences of speech perception, and Hannah Guest. Yes, sorry, it wasn't on the programme. Thank you.
So, how do we go? Is it just these buttons here?
Just green.
Thank you.
This one.
Okay, great.
And then this is going to tell you.
Oh, that's horrifying. Oh, wow. Turn it around and do without that. Actually, can I turn it around? Okay. Good afternoon. My name's Hannah Guest. This is Alex Sturrock, and we're here to talk about the SPACE project, which investigates speech perception by autistic adults in complex auditory environments, and links in very nicely with Beck's talk, I think. Oh, Autism at Manchester is a research network that, sorry, my picture's just disappeared there. Oh, thank you. Autism at Manchester is a research network that brings together researchers, clinicians, and the autistic community to understand and shape autism research. Members of its expert by experience group, George Bendo and Graham Hanks, identified speech perception as an autism research priority. Sorry, my screen's just gone again. Okay. And it's gone again. I'm not sure what the connection is. I'll try and remember. Oh, maybe that's done it. So if we look at the literature, there are long-standing personal reports of speech perception difficulties amongst autistic people, as Beck has alluded to. But actually, if you look at results in the lab, they are somewhat inconclusive and inconsistent. Possible reasons for this include the fact that hypotheses historically have generally not been grounded in detailed autistic experience. Research methods have generally not been designed with autistic input. Most studies are somewhat low-powered, so most but not all have under 20 autistic participants. And generally, there's little consideration of heterogeneity in the autistic population. We believe that valid research in this area needs to be guided by autistic insight. If we want to know the nature, extent, and impact of speech perception differences in autistic people, then surely the first step has to be to ask them. And ideally, research in this area should be by autistic people, not just with, for, or at worst on autistic people. And that stopped as well. Okay, so the SPACE project is a 6-person team combined of both autistic and neurotypical researchers. Phase 1 has been about gathering self-report data on which to base hypotheses about underlying mechanisms of speech perception differences. And then the second phase will be to test those hypotheses. Okay. No. Okay. Okay. If we look at the first phase, which is the self-report, there have been 3 streams of data we've looked at. The first have been a small set of interviews, which we've analysed thematically. The second have been free text data, which analysed via content analysis. And the third is closed set data, which have been analysed quantitatively. And the combined and integrated findings of those first 2 forms of data will be discussed by Alex.
Thank you. Oh, I see the problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so participants told us about a number of factors here, so I'll talk you through them. We can start off with acoustic factors, such as loudness of background noise. And non-acoustic factors such as visual processing and things like internal state. Now, these things contributed together to cause listening difficulties for the individual, and people also identified listening differences, which they talked about in terms of being different from their non-autistic peers, their functionality in these areas. Importantly, we think are these compounding factors. And the compounding factors include things such as conversational partners not really recognising the speech perception difficulties. And this was particularly important when it was things like clinicians, so people are going to seek support from clinicians, and the clinicians themselves aren't recognising it. All of these combine together to create a significant impact for the individual. And the biggest impacts were seen in things like social relationships, personal self-esteem, well-being and participation in things such as work and education. In a positive note, we saw also coping strategies that individuals had developed at all different levels of this model, but usually those coping mechanisms were developed in isolation and were self-generated basically from experience. Okay, so I'm just going to give you some quotes to illustrate some of that. So we have listening differences here. That included difficulty focusing on target voice. So we heard things such as, it's frustratingly hard to focus on somebody when other people are talking, even if they are being very quiet. We heard about drowning out of target voice, and we heard about things such as auditory overload. So I'm not afraid of the crowd, I'm afraid of the noises of the crowd. There were contributing factors as well, such as diversity of background sounds, and this made the listening difficulties more pronounced. I found that the amount of different noises affect me more than the volume of the noises themselves. And visual cues. These could be either positive or negative, but in this example, we can see that the visual cues are helpful. If I can't see them when they start the conversation, I will not pick up that they're talking to me at all. Here are the compounding factors that I mentioned that were really important, we thought were particularly important. So lack of understanding by communication partners. This quote seems to suggest somebody trying to understand the experience for the autistic person, but kind of getting it wrong. And we heard, I don't think it affects them like it affects me. To them, it's probably just an annoyance, but for me, it's affecting my entire evening. So it's something about that gravity of the difficulty. And here we have about the lack of understanding by clinicians. This is about an individual who's gone to seek support about their hearing. They're not diagnosed as autistic at this point. They've gone to seek support and they get told, no, there's nothing wrong. And the person has come away thinking, you're trying to work out then, why can't I hear someone? Why can't I have a normal conversation? Here's some quotes about the impact, so social participation. If I were to go to a party, I can't understand people, so I can't effectively socialise whether I go or not. The impression made on others. People probably think I don't care very much sometimes, like I'm not paying attention. And this quote came from someone talking about their experiences of being in work meetings and not being able to filter out background noise, so appearing in this way. And the impact on emotion was, as I say, very significant. And this is, it's very stressful because I'm missing out. I'm missing stuff, and my head starts going, you're not reacting right. So this, again, is this idea that people are taking it on themselves. They're thinking themselves less good at something because of this hearing difficulty. Okay, and we also heard about coping mechanisms, and we heard about communication tactics, such as asking somebody to speak louder or slow down. We heard about the use of technology, and we also heard about people managing the listening environment, so taking a small group out of a large group so that you could concentrate on that interaction. But again, these were self-generated strategies. Okay, Hannah.
If we move on to the closed set data, we first asked people how easy or difficult they found it to listen to a person speaking in a variety of listening environments. Over on the left there, we have a silent environment, and to the right of that, we have various kinds of noise at a moderate volume. And then on the lower row, we have louder versions of the noise above. And the general trends you see are that in most environments, the majority of participants are experiencing some degree of difficulty at least. The kind of fairly obvious finding, I suppose, that louder noises are more problematic than quieter ones. But we also see this general pattern where as you move from left to right, from mechanical noise to music to voices, we get more and more difficulty coming in. So a sense that the complexity of background noise is causing an issue there. We then asked about whether people had greater difficulty than other people the same age as them in the same listening environments. The most common answer was definitely in all listening environments. And you're also seeing over on the right-hand side there that that's really strikingly obvious for those situations with background voices. So again, seeing that sort of disproportionate effect of background voices. Finally, we asked people about 5 potential domains that might be impacted by listening difficulties, and across the board, the most common answer is very much impact. Then, if we move on to a summary of those closed set data, most respondents consistently feel that they definitely struggle more than other people the same age. The more complex the background sounds, the greater the difficulty, and most respondents report substantial and diverse impacts of listening difficulties. And if we look at the integrated findings from all of those self-report data together, we see widespread listening difficulties affecting a majority of autistic participants, diverse types of listening difficulty indicating potentially heterogeneous underlying mechanisms which we might need to disentangle in our laboratory research, substantial and varied impacts of listening difficulties, lack of understanding of listening difficulties by various parties, and as Alex highlighted, particular difficulty when that's coming from clinicians, and finally diverse coping strategies, usually self-devised.
Okay, so here are some of our take-home messages regarding future research work. So first of all, as Hannah said, we're interested in all the different types of listening difficulties that the participants reported, and we need to unpick that systematically. We're recognising that this is a very heterogeneous type of difficulty, and so we feel that there's a need for large sample sizes, including maybe some online solutions. In addition, we want to keep working with the autistic participants to generate hypotheses and to modify our listening tasks and listening conditions. Supporting our findings, we have from Kate Blackthorne some of her findings, which is working with autistic and non-autistic individuals, and it's shown that in test conditions, complex background noises are in fact more difficult for the autistic people. So that's things like speech sounds in the background. Okay. Wrap up. Okay. I suppose there's lots of things to take home messages here, but we believe this is really impactful for the individual. We believe that we need to raise awareness among clinicians and communication partners. And we're working with master's students at the moment to feedback self-generated strategies to the community. And
wait 1 second.
okay. Okay. We have lots of things that we'd like to talk about, including our desire to keep working in a collaborative way on this type of work. And I just wanted to finish by saying that feedback from Autism at Manchester advocate, an autism advocate, Lene, who's at the back of the room right now, was to say that I know hundreds of autistic people, and difficulty with auditory processing with background noise is the only universal characteristic I've been able to find. And I think that kind of underpins the maybe importance of future work in this area.
Wonderful, thank you very much. The next speaker is Daniel Poole, and Daniel will be talking about autistic and ADHD adults' experiences of attention, distraction, and
Okay, thanks very much. I just want to say as well, it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to present here today. This has been a fantastic conference so far. It's a little backwards to start with the acknowledgements, but I just want to draw attention to the fact that although I'm here presenting today, the work that I'm going to be talking you through has come from a really strong research collaboration from a neurodiverse team of researchers from different institutions, and we've also had some really valuable input from a number of consultants as well. It takes quite a while. There we go, okay. So the typical way that we would research attention in neurodivergent groups is using case control designs grounded in cognitive sciences.
Just check.
Yeah. Oh, that one's better, is it? That was a dodgy one. So you might, what we researchers might typically do is invite participants to come into the lab where we will ask them to complete these constrained, often very boring experiments where we'll ask the participant to make some kind of judgment, quite an arbitrary judgment. For instance, what letter is coloured in green here? And you make that judgment whilst trying to ignore some other distracting stimuli. The researcher will then take some measure of performance, so this might commonly be response time, then take an average from that group, from the neurodivergent group, and then compare this with the average from a group from the predominant neurotype. Now, this kind of research has been valuable in many ways. This really describes most of the work that I do, so I'm not too negative about it. But there are limits in what it can inform us. So most obviously, these kinds of tasks don't have the contextual and affective components which shape attention in our everyday lives. Also, it's commonly the case, but not always, that because these paradigms have been developed for the predominant neurotype, any deviation in performance is often seen as a deficit in the part of the neurodivergent group. We also have this whole range of different concepts related to attention, which autistic and ADHD people have talked about. I've listed some of them here. But this has received relatively little empirical research. So in particular, experiences around focus, like flow, hyperfocus, and how this might be modulated by interest, the monotropism theory. So in the present study, we conducted a large-scale online survey to try and understand a bit better about how attention is experienced in everyday life, the contexts which shape attention experiences, and also the kinds of strategies or workarounds that people use to deal with the challenging aspects. And then we were interested in the extent to which these experiences differed and also the ways in which they overlapped between different neurotypes, so autism and ADHD and the predominant neurotype in this work. The survey we developed went through quite an extensive process of negotiation within team and also with working with non-academic autistic and ADHD people. You might notice I've not provided any definition of attention so far, and the idea is we would try and sidestep the kinds of debates that are ongoing in the cognitive sciences and try to ground the work we were doing in the participants' own experiences. So we asked them about distraction and focus, and we used a mixed methods design. So here's an example on the side of the screen here. The participant would respond to a quantitative question, something like, how often are you distracted by the things around you? And then they'd have the opportunity to write some more in an open text box. Following feedback, we also had some prompts as well to kind of anchor the participants' thinking, and also encourage the participants to think about any positive elements as well as the challenges. I should shout out as well to my colleague Freya, who created these really nice visual infographics to try and explain some of the more abstract concepts. The work was also pre-registered, so that means the data processing and analysis plan we agreed to in advance. Okay, the participants in the study have been 35 ADHD adults, 100 autistic adults, 110 who are autistic and ADHD, and 117 from the predominant neurotype. I'm just showing you here the participants' ages. I'm just going to quickly explain this kind of figure because I rely on this a lot for showing data. This is a density plot, which is essentially a smoothed out version of a histogram. The important bit to know is that the peak of the hill is where most of the participants are contained, but you also get a sense of the spread as well. So the relevant thing here is that the distribution of ages was quite similar between the different neurotypes. And in terms of the participant identified their neurotype themselves, they were either had a clinical diagnosis or self-identified, but we did also ask them for this study to complete some standard screening measures as well. So in one of the quantitative questions, we asked participants, how long can you focus on something that you're interested in? And we had these discrete time bins that the participant could respond in. The neurodivergent groups, across all the participant groups, a lot of responses were that participants could maintain their attention on things they were interested in for 5 hours or more, the longest we offered, whereas for the predominant neurotype, they couldn't reach these same levels. We asked participants how often they're distracted by the things around them. So this is external distractions. The ADHD group and the autistic ADHD group described this as something that was happening to them a lot, whereas the autistic group described this as something common, but not quite to the same extent. The predominant neurotype is something that happened sometimes, and there's quite a lot of variability in the participants' responses. We asked participants how often do internal distractions, so thoughts, ruminations, and so on, interrupt what you're trying to do. The pattern for the ADHD group was very similar to what was observed for the external distractions. The autistic group, somewhat more variable in how they responded to this item. And interestingly, the autistic ADHD group were somewhat more similar to the autistic than the ADHD group on this one, whereas the predominant neurotype responding very much in the same way as for the external distractions. Okay, so as I mentioned, we also had some open-ended questions as well, and we used an analytic approach called content, or we're using an approach called content analysis, which is essentially a process of data reduction. We've got this huge volume of very rich data from this survey. So how we're doing that is myself and my colleague Brian have been developing and negotiating a code book, which the code book has been based on a third of the data set. So it's the codes that we've developed are based on what the participants said. And this code book contains currently 322 different items, and we've organized these in a hierarchical way. So at the top, this is displayed by this wheel. At the top level, we're looking at strategies, so those are the workarounds, context, distraction, and focus. And we've really further refined what this sort of hierarchical structure looks like through consultation. It's not finished. I'm also running out of time, so I'm just only really presenting a little snapshot here of some very preliminary findings. So if we look at distraction, so on the top row, this is codes, the percentage of people who received that code. Distraction was reported quite commonly across the different neurotypes, and the things which distracted people were people, noise, thoughts, and visual information. Those were the top 4. Somewhat to a similar extent between the different neurotypes, though interesting to note that the predominant neurotype described visual distractions much less commonly than the other neurotypes. Just zooming in on distraction of thoughts, which hasn't really been investigated that extensively to date. And the codes participants received here related to triggering a train of thought, so the unfolding series of associations based on some stimulus, either external or internal, more common in the ADHD group. People's own internal conversations distracting them, and then daydreams as well. And interesting there that the autistic group reported fewer really distracting daydreams. So sorry, that's a really short snapshot of what's quite a rich data set. But I think what I would like to take away from this is that there's really quite a lot of individual variability in these kinds of distraction attention experiences across all these different neurotypes. There do seem to be some notable areas of difference and of overlap between neurotypes, and as a very preliminary observation, our autistic ADHD group seem to be responding differently to the autistic or ADHD alone participants. Hoping that this work is going to be provide an evidence base for making environments more accessible, highlighting the kinds of environmental factors which create challenges, but also where people's strengths can also be harnessed, and also ultimately rethinking how we research attention moving forwards, trying to bring this sort of contextual factors and interest as a really important component of attention. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, and our final speakers are Alexandra Hendry and Victoria Hulks, who are going to be talking about the feasibility and acceptability of a new parent-toddler programme.
Okay, so one left. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So, yeah, I'm going to start. I'm Alex. I'm the lead investigator for the START programme. I'll start by outlining the rationale and the kind of development process for START, and then I'll hand over to Vicky, who'll talk us through some acceptability and feasibility findings. So the core of START is this idea that executive functions are really fundamental building blocks for social and cognitive development. And these skills begin to develop in infancy and toddlerhood. And they include things like inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility, and working memory. And these skills are absolutely fundamental for a whole range of positive life outcomes, such that people with executive function difficulties often experience difficulties with independent living, with mental health, and experience lower quality of life. There's plenty of evidence suggesting that both autism and ADHD are associated with executive function difficulties. And of course, you'll all be aware that autism and ADHD are highly co-occurring and heritable. And it's thought that executive function difficulties might be a genetically influenced link that underpins some of this overlap. And as a consequence, executive function difficulties are often found in individuals with first-degree relatives, so a sibling or a parent who's got autism or ADHD as well. Now, not all of these children will go on to receive a diagnosis of autism or ADHD, despite having those executive function difficulties and struggling maybe academically, maybe with their mental health. And because they're not given a diagnostic criteria, they're likely to fall through the gaps in service provision. Meanwhile, for those who do receive a diagnosis of autism or ADHD, supporting executive function development early in life might reduce the need for specialist services later on. But perhaps most important, supporting executive function development should be able to meet the kind of community-identified needs for research and early identification and interventions to support the kinds of things that will impact on quality of life later on. And that's what we're trying to do with the START project. It's not about promoting one neurotype or another. It's about supporting children's ability to pursue their own goals, empowering them to cope with the day-to-day demands of life by supporting the development of their executive function skills. Now, we do this through a 12-week program that's designed around kind of several evidence-based principles. So the first idea is that early support, just when these skills are first developing, might provide the greatest opportunity to achieve stable and wide-ranging improvements in executive function. So we start in the kind of that toddler period. We also know that parents help shape executive function development and that parental mental health is influential for child development. So it's really critical that we're not stressing or blaming parents here, but supporting them. And we do that with a peer support model. And it was important to me to work with a delivery partner who kind of embraced that approach. So I've partnered with people who have been recognising what parents already do and supporting them to do more for over 20 years. And we kind of added to that kind of principle of value and respect by really imposing a kind of a neuro and cultural diversity perspective within the programme, that there's no perfect way of parenting or thinking or acting. It's really kind of designed to be supportive and very inclusive. And the kind of the final evidence-based principles here is that in order to be effective, skill practice should be practiced in a context designed to increase joy and social connectedness. So this is all about fun. These are toddlers. They shouldn't be kind of doing very stressful activities. So it's songs, it's rhymes, it's stories and play. And we also know that executive functions develop best when we're not overwhelmed or stressed. So the practitioners are trained to make sure that the sessions are inclusive and responsive to the sensory and processing needs, both of the toddlers and of the parents. So, with that in mind, I kind of created a starting point for the project and trialled it with 2 rounds of pre-pilots in socioeconomically disadvantaged neighbourhoods around Oxfordshire, kind of refining the programme with feedback from parents, practitioners and toddlers. And then worked that up into a funding proposal to co-refine and pilot the programme specifically for these toddlers with a family history of autism and ADHD, and did that in consultation with 2 neurodivergent parents and a broader panel of autistic adults. Then, once we were given funding, we kind of launched into a year-long co-refinement process. So it was really important to make sure that we had checks and balances and a shaping of the programme at all points. I don't have time to kind of go into this in a lot of depth, but I just wanted to flag up that we've received really positive comments from our advisory panel all the way through, so that as we move into the pilot phase, we're really confident that this is a programme that is aligned with the community interests. So Vicky's now going to talk us through the initial findings. That one.
Okay, so just to first of all let you know about the recruitment, we had 13 parents who were enrolled across the 2 pilot sessions, and 7 parents, so over half, completed 7 or more of the sessions, which met our target because we were accounting for the fact that parents can't come every week. There's often things that do crop up. And so we made sure that we had catch-up sessions incorporated within the group programme, for example, as well. But what about those parents that didn't attend quite as often as we were hoping for? Well, we did look into the context for that, and there were some impacting factors. It turns out that Monday's not a great session day to pick. It's a logistically more difficult day for some families, so we won't be doing that next time. And of the 2 parents who dropped out early on, reasons for this that they gave were feeling a bit overwhelmed with being in a group and having a bit of difficulty coping, and that particular parent had a lot going on at the time. Her child was going through the diagnostic process. And another parent was a speech and language therapist and felt she was quite familiar with some of the content already. And that really is a lesson for us in terms of being quite clear about setting expectations during the recruitment process. Other barriers that we couldn't really have foreseen really included travel disruptions, some really rotten weather. One parent had to have an operation, and the Queen died actually during the course of the groups as well, so we couldn't really predict that was going to happen. In terms of intervention fidelity, and by that I mean how effectively the groups were carried out according to the predefined plans and aims that we'd set, well, all the start group sessions were audio recorded, which was nice and subtle, not as invasive as video recording. And practitioners completed their own feedback questionnaires after the sessions about how well the sessions had gone according to our aims and plans. And then the researchers were able to also complete those questionnaires based on the audio recordings that we had. And we could compare our ratings together. So for the fidelity questionnaire, we were looking at how the sessions were carried out according to the really broad START group aims. And those were things that happened week on week for all the sessions, things like fostering peer-to-peer support. And then we were rating the adherence to the more specific session aims, and these did change week on week and would be things like implementing activities, practicing shifting attention. And we also sought additional feedback comments. Pleasingly, all the sessions were delivered to either an acceptable or high fidelity standard, and that was in terms of both the broad session aims and also the specific session aims. I haven't got long, so I'll just give you a very quick overview here. For the ratings, we had 1 meaning partially met and 2 meaning fully met aims. And you can see practitioners and researchers' ratings there were rated fairly highly. They were either partially met or fully met. And the same went for the specific session aims as well. We were a little bit more closely aligned here. But there were some aims that weren't fully met, and we did want to know why. So we tried to look at the context behind those ratings. And we did this through debrief video calls, which we had with the practitioners after every session, and also a final endpoint interview. One practitioner reported she felt a bit of pressure to adhere to all the elements in one of the session plans. If it's on paper, then you might feel you have to cover everything. Practitioners reported that in the second pilot, some of the parents were arriving a little late, and they also had a more active child, and that impacted how much they could cover. And peer-to-peer support needed to be given a little bit more attention for the second pilot because the parents took a little longer to gel than in the first one. And practitioners also noted that their own knowledge and confidence grew as the sessions progressed, and that's a future measure of change which we'd really like to capture going forward to see how that might be impacting on adherence. And then, as Alex said, we wanted to make sure that the START sessions weren't just something which were contained in a group and then weren't transferred at home. We wanted it to be something which could be transferable to day-to-day life and routine activities. So we asked parents how often they were doing similar activities before START, and then asked them to rate how often they were doing them after a START session. And if you just look at the sort of yellow boxes, you can see that there was an increase out of the 49 parental responses that we were given. And we also asked parents how useful they found the session ideas. And although one parent said she was already familiar for one of the sessions with one of the ideas that was given, the vast majority rated the ideas as being very useful. And that was across the sessions and pilot groups. I haven't got time to read all these quotes, but hopefully you can have a quick flick that there was some nice positive comments there. So now we are recruiting for the feasibility randomised control trial, and that's going to be looking at the feasibility and acceptability of all aspects of the trial design. And we're starting from September in Oxford, and then we are going to go to a second location from January next year. And I think I've just about got on top. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Does anyone want to come and sit here? We're a little bit behind, but I've got enough time for one question per talk, if that's okay. Yeah, I mean, you don't need to, but if there's two of you, both come on, but one come, whatever. So let me start with Alexandra and Hannah. Yeah, lots of talks about sort of co-occurring conditions. So one question was about what do we know about the similarities between auditory processing difficulties in autism and ADHD? Have anything to say about that?
I don't. My area, so I'm an auditory scientist, and I've turned my eye to the autistic community, but I haven't really looked in ADHD, so I'll be honest, I don't really know.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there was one as well about dyspraxia. Background noise can be an issue for dyspraxic people. Mm-hmm. Two, how can we help people realise the complexity of neurodiversity and overlap of different types?
I mean, I think I can't answer the specifics about dyspraxia there for the same reason as the last question, but I think the general point about appreciating and understanding the complexity of heterogeneity amongst sort of diagnostic categories and diagnostic crossover, as well as within the different types of listening difficulty is worthwhile. I think there's just so much messiness in both dimensions, and research designs that fail to take account of that are inevitably going to miss out on the full picture.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen that across lots of talks in this conference, haven't we, that it is messy, and that's okay, we can embrace the messiness. Daniel, you had lots of questions, also lots about co-occurrence. So one question was, what would you theorise is the reason that the combined autistic ADHD group are less often impacted by internal distractions than the ADHD-only group?
Well, yeah, a good question. I'd love to know the answer to that. I want to caveat by saying this is something that's very preliminary and it's just in our study. So I'm not aware of any other research which has looked at this directly, which I could base this upon. I suppose anything I might suggest here is going to be entirely speculative, so I'm not sure I can really answer it at this point. Sorry if that's a bit unsatisfying. But I suppose perhaps resonating with the previous point as well, perhaps it shows it's in support of this idea, and it's been talked about a lot today as well, of moving beyond those sort of diagnostic categories and trying to understand these differences from a sort of transdiagnostic approach. What are the predictors of those kinds of differences, and that might be more fruitful than I can attack that problem from the labelling.
Yeah, thank you. Alex and Vicky, from your own experience, how can people support opportunities for executive function development amongst autistic and ADHD people without increasing pressure or anxiety? So I guess, that was one of the sort of issues you brought up, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, I think Alex did mention in the groups that we've been carrying out in the START project, the idea is the practitioners introduce the ideas behind the activities that be supporting an element of executive function. So it could be something like sustaining your attention for a little bit longer with your child. But when they present those ideas, they're not setting a goal or a threshold that they're aiming for. They're simply saying, well, these are some suggestions or ideas that you could work on, pick an idea or an activity that your child is really interested in, they really want to do, and then just see if you can sort of set a threshold that works for them. So it's not putting out there some sort of predefined goal that we want them to achieve. It's something that comes from the parents and the child together.
Yeah.
And that seems to work really well, and parents respond well to that.
Yeah, thank you. There were lots and lots of questions. I don't know if the speakers will be able to see those questions, but I feel like we should probably end it now because it's just past 10 to. But please do speak to the speakers, tweet to the speakers, talk to the speakers with any questions you have. And thank you very much for attending the session, and sorry about all the technical difficulties.